All right, so 2 minutes past the hour, so I believe we can get started. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are based. My name is François Pougel. I'm a senior project coordinator and a consultant with Perspectives Climate Research. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this online seminar on the Cochrane project. So our project is funded by the European Union and it aims to support decisions on whether or not and under which circumstances SRM research and experiments may be warranted from scientific and societal viewpoints. Today, we're going to talk about the precautionary principle and what it could mean for SRM research. So with me today, we have our keynote speaker, Julie Winders, and two discussants, Jonathan Wiener and Gareth Davis. So Julie is a senior research analyst with trilateral research in the United Kingdom, and she'll be introducing you to the precautionary principle and what it could mean for SRM research and its governance. Jonathan is a professor of law at Duke University, and Gareth is a professor of European law at Vrije University in Amsterdam. We can move to the agenda, please. So we're going to start these very short introductions and reflections, and then we're going to move into a moderated discussion. Julie will be moderating this discussion, and then we will gently close up in about an hour. All right, Julie, over to you for the keynote talk.
Yes, thank you very much, Francois, for that introduction. Welcome everyone to this seminar on the precautionary principle. My name is Julie Winders. I'm a senior research analyst at Trilateral Research, and I'm part of the Cochrane project, where I lead the legal analysis of SRM and SRM research. Recently, I took a deeper dive into the precautionary principle together with Gareth Davis, who's joined us here today as well. And we published a paper in the European Journal of Risk Regulation on the precautionary principle in the context of SRM. So some of the presentation today will reflect some of the findings from that paper, but we'll also have an opportunity to hear from Gareth and reflect or dive deeper into the topic during the moderated discussion. But first things first, I'll start with going back to the basics. What exactly is the precautionary principle, and where does it come from? Precaution, what is the meaning? So it's essentially the idea that caution is exercised beforehand to avoid danger or to ensure a good result. It's also described as prudent foresight, and precautionary is essentially the adjective of precaution as a noun. So the idea is that you're acting before a certain harm essentially materializes, and as a principle of law, the precautionary principle is recognized at the international level as well as at the EU level, particularly in relation to the protection of the environment and human health. And some of the, or one of the sort of most referenced or common wording that we see is of Principle 15 of the Rio Declaration. So I'll just read it out for everyone. In order to protect the environment, the precautionary approach shall be widely applied by states according to their capabilities. Where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason to postpone cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. And a very similar wording has been adopted under the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, Article 3, so specifically recognizing precaution in relation to climate change. And the principle is also recognized in relation to the environment under the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU. So what does that really mean then? The precautionary principle is a principle that essentially gives states a right, and in certain circumstances where there's a threat of serious or irreversible harm, an obligation to take precautionary measures to prevent environmental harm. This is an anticipation of a risk of harm, and there's that right or that obligation is applicable, even if there's no full scientific certainty around the risk of harm. So the principle enables the taking of precautionary measures despite scientific uncertainty. So what that really means is that states will need to do a wide assessment of the available scientific knowledge and what that scientific knowledge has to say about the risk of harm to inform decision making. So it is an enabling principle to take preventative measures in a risk environment, essentially. So when we talk about solar radiation modification, or SRM short, the precautionary principle has been invoked both by proponents and opponents of SRM. And essentially different arguments, precautionary arguments can be made for and against SRM. On the one hand, SRM has been seen as introducing risks. So there's risks involved with deployment of SRM, and therefore precautionary measures would need to be taken to restrict SRM deployment. On the other hand, SRM has been proposed, or the original thinking behind SRM is that it would be a response in addition, a response to climate change, in addition to mitigation and adaptation as a sort of way of shaving off peak warming. So in a sense, you could say that SRM would be a precautionary measures against the possible risks of climate change. And similar thinking applies to, or extending that to research. There are risks both with SRM research, but those are more involved, more focused on political or societal consequences that research might have, that I'll touch upon a bit more in a minute. And on the other hand, there are arguments that can be made that not researching SRM could leave us unprepared or uninformed when later on we might wish that we had done our research. And so sort of precautionary regret in that sense. So to kind of try and make sense, when Gareth and I took a deeper dive into this legal principle, it essentially identified that there are different types of risks. There's environmental, physical risks of physical damage, and on the other hand, there are political and societal risks, particularly with SRM deployment, but also with SRM research. So the idea that SRM research could create a moral hazard and essentially disincentivize emission reductions, or that or the slippery slope argument, which is the idea that researching SRM will inevitably lead to deployment because it sort of legitimizes SRM as an idea and as a policy option in the climate debate, as well as the risk of geopolitical conflict, or the fact that SRM research or potentially deployment could be seen as an aggressive act by other states. And then there's risks of inaction. So we talk about SRM as being risky and involving introducing new risks, but arguably there's also risk with inaction. So in the scenario, a worst case climate scenario where climate mitigation efforts aren't sufficient to respond or to prevent dangerous climate change, could lead to a situation where we are unprepared and we do not have SRM available to respond, or it could potentially lead to ill-informed deployment because we have not done research, or we've not developed the scientific knowledge to have a better understanding of the potential and limitations of SRM. But there's no reason in law really to prioritize or only look at one type of risk over the other. So that there are different types of risks involved, and important not to ignore any one of those. So if we try and create a sort of overview or map this somehow in terms of what the different risks of harm are, and what the different possible precautionary responses are, or the different responses that are being discussed or have been raised in response to the risk of harm. On the one hand, we're starting with climate change causing significant environmental damage, and climate mitigation and climate adaptation are essentially precautionary responses to try and prevent the environmental damage that climate change might cause. And in addition to that, SRM is then essentially proposed as a possible solution to shave off that peak warming, although we currently don't have the scientific knowledge whether it will actually be an effective measure just yet. So then moving on, the SRM deployment introduces certain significant risks of environmental damage. In a way, those risks are symmetric to climate change, as well as wider social and political consequences that SRM might have. So that has led to proposals for a moratorium or a non-use agreement for SRM deployments, or alternative responses include developing international governance regime for deployments and in order to remove some of those scientific uncertainties around SRM, a proposal has been to fund and essentially look into doing more SRM research. And SRM research essentially has its own risks of moral hazard, slippery slope, and geopolitical conflicts, like I mentioned. So in response to the risks of SRM research, we see that there are calls to either restrict research or even place a moratorium on research, or perhaps on field experiments, or develop some sort of research governance framework. And then finally, no research could also result in risk, or has a risk of harm in the sense of that we might be unprepared, and it could lead to ill-informed unilateral deployment of SRM in a sort of desperate potential future scenario of worst case climate change. So SRM research could be precautionary measures to avoid that scenario, to develop a deeper understanding of the science and the possibilities there, as well as international cooperation. So if that's not all too confusing, it might seem like the precautionary principle leaves us in a sort of state of paralysis. There's no clear, safe choice here, and there's risks of both action and inaction. There's risks of deploying SRM, but there's also risks involved with not developing SRM in the scenario of wishing we had it available just in case. There's risks with researching SRM in terms of the political and the societal consequences that research might have. But on the other hand, not researching it might leave us in a state of unpreparedness. So how do we go about applying this principle then and operationalizing it in terms of informing policy decisions? So in a sense, the principle leaves a lot of policy discretion to decision makers and a lot of room to consider the different types of risks and based on the best available science. And we'll dive deeper into that a little bit into in the discussion as well. But essentially, from a legal perspective, an obligation to take precautionary measure is essentially this exact exercise of doing a wide assessment of all the different types of risks involved, based on the best available science to inform policy choice, to consider the risks of action as well as inaction. And what's important to remember is that as a principle, it's not prescribing any one particular outcome. It's rather an obligation of conduct rather than achieving a particular result. So the point is that policymakers go through this exercise of considering the various types of risks and then decide the appropriate action within, which essentially lies within their policy discretion. So the ultimate policy choice in that sense is political and value based, even though the assessment of risks essentially lies in an assessment of the best available science. So I'll pause there and we can now dive into some of the expert reflections. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and bring Gareth in. So Gareth, you and I, we obviously worked together on the paper. Do you have any further reflections on this presentation and how you see the precautionary principle that's been applied to SRM so far, and what your thoughts are on that?
Well, thanks, Julie. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I mean, I agree with pretty much everything you said since we wrote the paper together. Um, but one thing that always strikes me about the precautionary principle is not really a great fit for SRM or geoengineering. It's quite an unnatural fit, and I wouldn't say it can't be made to fit, but the people who throw it into discussion tend to just ignore the particular novelties. And historically it was developed and it's always been used in situations where the default of no action is the safe choice. You've always got a new chemical, a new product, a new technology, and if you just do nothing, that might be economically advantageous, it might be boring, but it's safe. So it's always been quite clear you've got a kind of safe status quo path which you're carrying on, and it's like, is it too risky to deviate from this path? And I think if there's one thing one can say about climate change, it's that doing nothing does not represent an obviously safe path. And so you've got a radically new situation where you have to look at things differently. And quite often, when the argument is made, oh, SRM is dangerous and the precautionary principle therefore means we shouldn't do it, I tend to read between the lines a kind of a double argument. I mean, there may be a fear of risks of SRM, but there's also a moral opposition to it. And there are perfectly reasonable, coherent arguments to object to SRM, I think, to say, as a matter of principle, you don't want to instrumentalize nature. You don't want to play with the environment or the climate. But it should be understood that these are actually anti-precautionary arguments. I mean, the nature of such arguments is you're essentially saying we think it's the wrong thing to do, and so we don't want to do it, even if that might bring risks, actually. So it's the opposite of a precautionary argument. And, often in moral situations, doing the right thing brings risks. And so there may be people who, as a matter of principle, feel we shouldn't manipulate the climate, and they make a stand on that, and that there are coherent arguments for that. But that brings risks that one might end up in a situation of runaway climate change and have no tools. So what they're saying is we're prepared to take those risks in order not to become a species that plays with the environment. Can be defended, but this is in no sense a precautionary argument. It needs different kinds of justifications. It's actually precisely anti-precautionary. And it's also anti-precautionary in the sense that one of the things that I don't see, there's sometimes the court speaks of a precautionary attitude, which probably should be distinguished from the precautionary principle in law, is the precautionary principle gets a lot of critique from people who say it's indeterminate and it inhibits innovation and it's vague and so on. And one response to that is actually, at least in European law, the court has made it something much more precise than this. It really is a very science-based principle. And it doesn't come into action just because of vague hypothetical fears, oh, this technology is scary. It really comes into action in very specific situations where science raises a concern, and you've got a safe path and a non-safe path, and you want to deal with this situation. But it only comes into action where you have science-based fears and you make science-based decision making. And sometimes that's easier in other situations. And if you want to know whether a chemical is dangerous, you can probably reduce that to a fairly science-based decision. But in the context of geoengineering and SRM, even maybe at some point it could be turned into a science-based decision, but at the moment we're probably not there. We simply don't have the science. So to speak of this in precautionary terms, in the sense that the law understands precaution, one would have to talk about political science as science, which, as a lawyer, I mean, maybe you can, maybe you can't. It's not, it doesn't have the precision. Really, the court likes the precautionary principle to be very rooted in fact. It's all about objectivizing. It's about, in a way, moving away from empty polemics and rhetoric and saying, before you do anything, try and make your decisions as objective and factual as you can. And you have to ask whether this is a context where that's actually appropriate. And I'm not convinced it is. And the other radical novelty of using precaution here is in almost all situations, the default precautionary approach is do some more research. If you're not quite sure, if you want to play safe, the answer is do some more research. Try and get some more information before you act. And the really, really interesting thing here is that precaution is being used as an argument against research. And as you've said, I mean, I don't think an argument can be made for both sides. It's all perfectly symmetrical. But I do think if one is going to deploy precaution in this context, one has to appreciate, if you like, the radical novelty of doing that, of saying the safe path is actually not to really know what the risks are. That's quite unique. I've never heard an argument like that made in any other context. And I think it's actually hard to sustain. I could go on, but I won't because there's other people with thoughts to share.
No, that's brilliant. Thanks a lot, Gareth. I think I see some questions popping in, but I'll hand over to Jonathan first for his reflections, and then we'll dive into a discussion later on. So, Jonathan, thanks for joining us today as well. You've written a lot on precautionary principle, on climate change, and the need to take a multi-risk approach to governance. What are your reflections on the precautionary principle and how it's been applied so far?
Yes, thank you, Julie, and it's great to be with you, and thank you, Francois, and also congrats to Julie and Gareth on this paper, which I think is helpful in promoting discussion. I also want to thank Matthias Honegger from CFG, who brought me together with you on this webinar. So I think this is a helpful opening to a set of interesting conversations, and then there are a number of additional avenues that we can explore, and some people are already exploring in the chat while we're talking. So let me just make a few initial points. First about precaution, and then about SRM and risk analysis. So first about precaution. In my research, which included a 10-year project jointly with colleagues in Europe and in the European Commission, produced a book called The Reality of Precaution in 2011, and then later a report from the International Risk Governance Council, IRGC, based in Switzerland in 2017, and a series of other articles. We tried to understand the precautionary principle and also compare United States and European approaches to precaution. And some of the key findings were, first, that there are different versions of precaution, multiple versions of the precautionary principle. I like that Julie, that you quoted the Rio Declaration, paragraph 15. And that's one version, which says that in the face of serious or irreversible risks, scientific uncertainty is not a basis for not acting, or it's a kind of a double or triple negative, and it's essentially permissive. It says that regulators can act on these serious risks in the face of uncertainty. But then there's a second version, which is more ambitious, which says that regulators should or must act, and a third version that says that the burden of demonstrating the safety or the net benefits of the alternative is on the proponent. That could be the proponent of a new technology, but it could also be the proponent of the policy, in which case the precautionary principle burden shifting version tends to swallow itself because the precautionary measure itself could pose risks. And there are actually, other versions too. Some scholars have identified. Per Sandin found 19 different versions. Dan Badansky found, I think, 5 or 6. So it's helpful to be careful about these particular versions. And I also appreciate Gareth's point about the science basis in the European Union system. So I think of the European Commission's communication on the precautionary principle in the year 2000, which emphasized that precautionary measures should be provisional and should be accompanied by continued research to better understand the uncertainties. So the second thing we looked at there was comparing the United States and Europe, and just a short summary is that we looked at almost 3,000 risks being regulated in the United States and Europe from 1970 to the early 2000s. And in that data sample and over that time period, what we found was most of the risks were regulated similarly in the United States and Europe, but there were some on which there were divergences. But interestingly, those divergences went in both directions. So sometimes more precautionary in Europe and sometimes more precautionary in the United States. And we could talk about many different examples. But the upshot is that both the United States and Europe are highly precautionary compared to the rest of the world most of the time, but also they differ sometimes on particular risks. And what's interesting is to try to understand, why do societies differ? Why do they select particular risks for greater precaution, for earlier, more anticipatory, and more stringent rules in the face of unfolding uncertainty? Okay, so with that as a kind of broad picture of precaution. Oh, and may I add, we also, with other colleagues, I did a follow-up study on the United States and China in a more limited study, looking at about 50 risks, and also found selective precaution in both the United States and China on different risks. So let's turn now to SRM, to solar radiation modification. And there again, I think it's helpful that we could note that there are different versions or forms of SRM techniques. So not only SAI, stratospheric aerosol injection, and even within SAI, there could be different compounds or materials used, sulfate, calcite, other potential types of particles used. But then there are also other approaches to SRM, including marine cloud brightening, cirrus cloud thinning, and potential space-based sunshade options. And so each of those may have a different risk profile and warrants comparison or consideration of the different risks and trade-offs. But I think I agree with the general point that you're making, that there are risks on both or all sides. And so in a series of papers with I noticed several colleagues, by the way, in the participants list here. For example, Axel Mikalawa and I were both on the IPCC chapter in 2014 Fifth Assessment Report, which has a section on governance of geoengineering. And Tyler Felgenhauer and I co-authored a set of papers with colleagues on risk analysis of SRM. One of those published in 2022 by the C2G, and I see Janos Pastor is here also, and Jesse Reynolds. And so it's great to see so many colleagues here. So in our work, we've tried not to advocate or oppose SRM, but to analyze and understand the multi-risk profile, including both the physical environmental risks and the social, political, geopolitical risks, and including on both sides. There was a comment in the chat that our newest paper that's just come out in Oxford Open Climate Change, March 2025, only looks at socio-political risks on one side, but I don't think that's right. I mean, clearly the risks of climate change include socio-political risks as well as physical, and sometimes interconnected. So for example, climate migration resulting from severe weather or climate change impacts, and then that migration affects social and political dimensions. And we have another paper coming out soon in the European Journal of Risk Regulation called Multi-Risk Governance of SRM. So what we draw from all of that is, first, the multi-risk character makes this complicated and challenging, and that we can't take a simple or narrow approach that looks only at one risk or one set of risks, and I want to refer to something that Gareth said about precautionary principle is applicable where the default choice is safe. And clearly that's not true in this example, so I agree with Gareth on that. But I also think that's not true really in all the other examples. And if the precautionary principle only applied where the default were safe, depending on the meaning of safe, which is itself an ambiguous and contested term, if that were if safe meant no risk, then there would be no application of the precautionary principle because there's no default option in which there's no risk. And that's true for chemicals regulation because we're always concerned about what the substitute chemical would be. And in any food safety, in any arena. So in my view, we always need a multi-risk, well-informed approach to making these important decisions. And I'll just close by saying, because there are many issues we could discuss further, but I'll just conclude by saying the kind of information generation that Tyler Felgenhauer and I and colleagues are working on, especially right now, is not only that some people are working on research on methods of SRM, but the suggestion that we want to add to that is development of a monitoring system in advance of development and potential deployment, recognizing that there could be unilateral deployment, and as Julie said, there could be ill-informed deployment. In addition to trying to be better informed about how to make those decisions ex ante, we also are suggesting that we need real-time information in case there is development, preparation, and then potential deployment. And that's in part to be able to monitor the physical environmental effects, but also in order to be able to share information to avoid the geopolitical conflicts that might arise. So I'll be happy to say more about the monitoring idea, and it's multifaceted itself. But thanks for inviting me to join the conversation. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for your reflections as well. Yes, so now we have about 30, sorry, I should say a bit less, 25 minutes or so for a moderated discussion. So we really encourage, and I see there's been some discussions in the chat already, but we would essentially invite you all to raise your hand if you have a question. If you're comfortable, you can come in, open your mic, and pose the question to the speakers, and we can have a discussion. Otherwise, we can also take questions in the chat, and I can raise them and bring them in. And if not, I have some discussion points that I can bring in as well. So I see someone has already raised a question. So Dana Rudingkite, if you're comfortable, please feel free to come in.
Yes, sorry, I was very fast in sending this message in the chat. It's always when you press enter, it goes in the air. Well, first, many thanks for this presentation and all those arguments. It has been a good summary of what is being debated in the context of the SRM debate. However, coming from the German legal debate and the debate on the precautionary principle, it's sometimes a bit astonishing to realize the arguments. But of course, we mentioned there are different concepts and perception of the precautionary principle. But my argument is, well, Julie, you mentioned that there is no legal reason why we could prioritize different risks. And this is exactly the point where I say, well, there are legal reasons. And in the chat, I put one argument for this already. The reason is that the precautionary principle is also about the chain of causation of a problem, of a risk. This is the prefix pre. It's not only about time or act early or act without consideration, of course not. This pre means beforehand in the chain of causation. So you should tackle a risk at its root causes. And often SRM is characterized as an end-of-pipe technology. And it does not change climate change. I mean, just to illustrate this, if there is a patient having cancer and the doctor are considering painkillers or chemotherapies, no doctor would call this a precautionary measure for cancer, maybe not smoking would be a precautionary measure. So, I mean, all the arguments you presented, they are fine and they are relevant, but this is not the precautionary principle, at least not in the German, and I think not in the European legal debate, which clearly prioritizes different risks. And maybe we could instead discuss a prevention or protection principle. But to my legal understanding, this is not the precautionary principle. But we might discuss, and there might be different legal reasonings. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Yes, I don't know if Jonathan or Gareth have any particular reflections on this. Want to come in?
Well, I'll just give a quick reaction because I know there are more people with questions. So one is, if precaution is understood to be anticipatory, then I think we try to assess degrees of precaution, or precaution as a spectrum, not a binary category, but a continuous spectrum. So the earlier, the more anticipatory, the more precautionary, and also the more stringent. Second, several narrative legal versions of the precautionary principle include the word prevent or prevention in the definition of their definition of the precautionary principle. So it's hard to distinguish prevention from precaution, or maybe even protection. But I take your point. But third, I take the point that SRM would not be preventing the emissions of greenhouse gases. It would not be reducing the driving factor in increasing greenhouse gases concentrations in the atmosphere, and thus changing the radiative balance of the Earth that way. It would be addressing the radiative balance of the Earth through reflecting, through changing the albedo of the Earth, and that has a different set of consequences. And so as we've said in our work, and my colleague Tyler says, SRM is not reversing climate change. It's adding another form of climate change at the same time as greenhouse gas forcing of climate. And that, I think, speaks to Gareth's point about both SRM and greenhouse gas emissions are changing nature. So so those all make this conversation interesting and complex. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, if I can just briefly come in, Dan, on your point, and on those different risks to respond to that as well. I think what Gareth and I certainly found is that what we looked at is not is I guess not only the risks of a particular invention, but also essentially the risks of a particular response. So in terms of climate change, I think the ideal response is sufficient emission reduction. So that is essentially the safer outcome. And the way in which we considered the principle is that precautionary planning doesn't only require sort of opting for the safest option and the safest outcome, but also considering or essentially planning for the fact that, or the risk that outcome might not be achieved. So that's from that point of view, the precautionary principle would involve considering a broad range of risks of action as well as inaction.
If I can just very briefly come in, I mean, I think it's important to realize that the precautionary principle is always, at least in law, is always focused on an action or an actor. It's not a general moral principle. For humanity, one might say, is a good argument that stopping emissions is more precautionary than SRM, for example. But humanity is not in the court. It's always addressed to a state or a body that wants to act. And the thing is, no, for example, if I consider the EU or Germany or the EU as a whole, they don't have the option of stopping climate change. It's not within their power. They don't, even if they were to put their own emissions down to zero tomorrow, that wouldn't have a significant effect on climate change. And so in that sense, they don't have this option. And then, to use your medical, which is an interesting analogy, it's a bit like someone being exposed to a carcinogen and being unable to avoid being exposed to a carcinogen, and saying, well, you know, one could wait until you have symptoms, or one could start a toxic therapy now. And it's a difficult choice because you might not need the therapy and it's harmful, but at the same time, if you wait till you got symptoms, the therapy might not work so well. And in that sense, it would be a difficult choice as to which was precautionary. And it could be that the what you call the end of pipe therapy would actually be the precautionary choice. And that's kind of the situation we're in. And it's interesting, I mean, in EU law, the precautionary principle is very much focused on the safest outcome, and that's typically a difference between, say, German and EU law. Is often they have the same kind of principles, but in EU law it tends to be more outcome focused and less structured and procedural, and it's just the difficult question of which leads to the safest outcome.
Thank you, Gareth. I see some hands up. Sam Kaufman, would you like to come in?
Hello, and thank you for hosting this webinar. I want to respond to what Gareth and Dana have said about, thinking about whether SRM would be precautionary or not precautionary. I would add that there's a difference between, as we have said ad nauseum, there's a difference between SRM research and SRM. Dana, you were saying that if it's an emergency response to an ongoing crisis, we wouldn't necessarily see that, in the moment action as precautionary. But what would certainly be precautionary is to look into it beforehand, just in case that might come up. Gareth, I know you said it in a polite way, but I appreciated earlier in the session how you referred to the idea that ignorance would be the precautionary approach. As well, I will say, in my opinion, that is a terrible, terrible idea, and it's stupid, and it imposes climate risks on the world. And so I'm glad to see discussion of SRM research as a potential precaution against climate risk. That doesn't mean all SRM research is good, but I think it does mean that maybe we should start more considering categorical opposition to research as not a good faith engagement in the space. There's a lot of conspiracy theorist and extremist discourse around climate and weather modification that has a very important role in the work that we do. And I think we should be careful to recognize anti-science or fear, uncertainty, and doubt discourse for what it is.
Thank you, Sam. Handing over to Claude, who I think is next.
Thank you. I just wrote actually my question on the chat. I will keep it short. Like, how far can we be to see ice glacier, to see something done for the ice in the Alps, because that's the center of Europe, and I'm wondering why in India or in China they already did that 10 years ago. We are talking about technology that involve much higher risk, but there are some intervention on the albedo that makes sense. So how far are we to really implement the technique that present the less risk?
Yes, thank you. I guess not all SRM techniques are maybe the same, and there are different risks involved with different techniques. So very important to make that distinction, or to take that into consideration as well. Thanks for that. I guess next we have Janos Pastor.
Hello, thank you for organizing this event and for giving me the floor. I wanted to bring up a different issue, but before, just very briefly, if I may react to something what Sam Kaufman said. So the way I see potential use of SRM, yes, it can be emergency response, but it's not an emergency in the sense of today's emergency, tomorrow we do something, and then 2 days later we've done our response. It's much longer term. It's still emergency, but long term. And in that context, it can still be precautionary in the sense of you do things and then eventually it's still a precautionary event. But anyway, that's not why I wanted to raise the the issue. So for me, I see a difference between a very good discussion here of the different aspects of the risks of doing and the risks of not doing, and I appreciate the various discussions we've had here. But I'm recalling one of the first slides, Julie, that you put up, or maybe not the first, but at some point you said that fundamentally it's a political issue, the way one interprets the precautionary principle. So if that is the case, then how can we, and I've seen that myself in the work that I've done over the last few years, how the precautionary principle is used very differently because of the political viewpoint of different actors. So the question is, how can we better, if you have any thoughts, any colleagues around the table, how can we bring better the scientific and the evidence that we have for the risks and of doing and not doing, and convert that into policy relevant ways of explaining this, so that eventually that political decision is better informed? Because that seems to me as absolutely key, and that may also have something, some impact on the point that Dana raised in her own comment in Germany. So that's my sort of question there.
Thank you very much. Any reactions from either Gareth or Jonathan on that point, or others from the audience?
Well, maybe very briefly. I mean, if there was in reconciling the sort of science and politics, if it was any other situation, I think the answer would be do some research, do some experiments. Bearing in mind small-scale experiments aren't dangerous and one can build them up slowly. And so that's what I find so fascinating. And I think there's an interesting analogy with lifestyle diseases in medicine, where you also have research into treatments for them. And there doesn't seem to be a great panic about, oh, if we develop a better treatment, then maybe people won't adapt their lifestyle. One has to have also can have prevention measures, but it is possible to reconcile them. And I would have thought a reconciliation of science and politics comes through increasing knowledge. And normally research would be the answer, but there's this very interesting and unusual attack on research as such. I see that Marie also has had a hand up for a little while.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I can't put my webcam because it is not working. But I am a climate researcher at the VUB in Belgium, and I am actually one of those climate researchers who are against doing further research. And so I thought I could just come in and provide some thoughts about why that is the case. Because actually, so we've put out a paper that's in review right now, and it's a review of propositions about polar geoengineering, which includes SRM, of course. And our point is that we don't have a very good understanding, like fundamental science understanding about climate and about climate change that is occurring. We know there's a lot of missing knowledge we have, right? In the IPCC reports, for example, there is the effects of clouds on radiative transfer, and so how much heating or cooling is being done by cloud is something that is a very fundamental thing we should know, but yet we don't have enough information. And with SRM, we're talking about manipulating clouds, right? And so in a way, to the ears of my community, that sounds a bit like playing God, because we don't understand how it works naturally. And now we're saying we're going to inject artificially aerosols into the atmosphere if we take SAI, for example. And for that, we know exactly what's going to happen. So it feels a bit schizophrenic, or like, I don't know, bipolar, saying like, we don't know enough about the natural system, yet we know enough to control it artificially. And the other point that is important, I think, about our argument towards not funding further research is that for any country, or even European funding, for example, we know the pot of money is final, right? It doesn't increase, it's not infinite. And so if you're going to be spending a lot of funding on doing research, like more funding on research into SRM, then that's money that is being taken out of, for example, mitigation, adaptation science. And and it's definitely taking the focus away. And we know in our geopolitical context, right, policymakers' attention is quickly taken away from climate change solutions. So in a sense, the SRM focus feels like it's adding another distraction from the known solutions, which are mitigation and adaptation, because it removes the source of the problem, which is the greenhouse gases. Yeah, that's it. Sorry, that was a very long point, but I thought it was relevant to this discussion.
Thank you very much, Marie. That's great. I see Dana has her hand up. Please come in.
Yeah, thanks. I would suggest some more differentiation regarding the debate on research and precautionary principle. Well, we should not just talk about research, but well, on the one hand, we have desktop research, and on the other hand, we have field experiments. And I assume that there is no real argument to prohibit desktop research in the term and to use the precautionary principle to justify this. I mean, it's just about gaining knowledge. This doesn't make sense. But if we are talking about field experiments, this is a real world activity having real consequences. So the reason can never be gaining knowledge, but the real world consequences and impacts. And yeah, there we have to think about, on the one hand, it's research, and on the other hand, it's development sometimes maybe. And we have to check what it is. And if it's more, there is no legitimate research interest, it's often rather development. And if there is a risk that it's development, so well there at least there could be many arguments here, and we should not just talk about research, but sometimes we have to shorten arguments in the debates to get some message in the air. So, but scientific discussions, they should look at those details. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dana. I think you raise a good point about research for different purposes and whether there's a need to distinguish on research for development or research more foundational, fundamental research. Thanks for that point. Zoltan, you have a question?
Yes.
Or your hand up at least.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me, first of all, because I had connection problems? Thank you.
Yes.
My name is Zoltán Rakoncai. I'm from the European Commission in DG Research and Innovation, and we actually funded this project. I happen to be the policy officer in charge, but that's not why I asked for the floor. I appreciate the discussion. Unfortunately, I joined late due to technical problems, which just shows our technical prowess, that it is challenging enough to join a video conference. I don't know how we are going to manage engineering the climate, but just two elements that I would like to highlight it, and apologies if they have been mentioned before I joined. One is that I heard the different interpretations of the precautionary principle in different contexts, like the EU context, international context, comparison with the US. I have not heard, and again, I might have missed it, how it is referred to in the context of the UNFCCC, because the Framework Convention on Climate Change actually has a reference to the precautionary principle, which is quite an explicit reference. And the reason why I'm mentioning it, it's in Article 3, is that it is framed solidly in the context of measures to anticipate, prevent, or minimize the causes of climate change. So it relates to actions which tackle the causes of climate change, which I think is an important consideration in this context. I wouldn't go into much detail on, but I think it's just something to be considered. So it's not a general reference to the precautionary principle, but something that is contextualized. The other thing is about the various elements of uncertainty and the need for research and all that. And I agree with those who said that there is a considerable amount of uncertainty and lack of understanding on how these things function, and they would be subject to legitimate research effort. One thing that is absolutely certain, or seems as certain as we can tell, is that SRM does not tackle the root causes of climate change. So, in that sense, I think it links to the discussion that I heard before about the prioritization of different measures and interventions and all that. So we know that this is something that does not address the root cause of the problem, even under the best of circumstances. And I'm just raising it because I think this is an important element that makes it a bit different from some of the analogies that were mentioned earlier, like cancer research and all that. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the continuation of this discussion, perhaps in other contexts, because surely we cannot do justice to this issue in this workshop. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your points, Zoltan. Yeah, and I agree. There's a lot more to unpack and a lot of topics and aspects, reports that have recently come out that we haven't been able to really touch upon. I'm conscious of time though, and I want to hand back to Francois to close the session today. And thanks everyone for your contributions. And a special thanks to our speakers as well, Jonathan and Gareth. Back to you, Francois.
Thank you, Julie. So I'll sum it up very quickly before we return to our lives, basically. So we've been talking about precautionary principle as a principle that relates to threats of serious or irreversible damage, and been discussing about all the different variants of this principle and the fact that in a risk-based context with no clear safe choice, this is really complicated. So yeah, it's not a great fit for SRM, but that's what we have. And I think this discussion was extremely interesting. I really appreciate all the input also we heard on the moderated discussion. So I took some notes about, different topics we covered. We've been talking about causation chains, potentially protection principles, and prevention, ignorance not being precaution, but also not overestimating our knowledge of the natural systems, discussions about funding and timeframes. And so, yeah, I think this was really, really great. And I would like to invite you all to, of course, continue this conversation on our stakeholder forum, for example. So you will find on this slide a couple of QR codes where you can actually join us on LinkedIn and follow our work. And so, yes, I'd like to invite you to do that. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Jonathan and Garrett, for your time today, for sharing your knowledge and contributing your expertise to this very thorny issue that is SRM research governance. Thank you also everyone who took part today for the very interesting conversations. And as I said, stay up to date with our work, stay in touch, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.